Okay. Well, hello everybody, both elsewhere and in the room. Should we wait until our in-person attendee comes back? Yeah. I don't think I've got a full-on hour of content, but hopefully people. But actually, we won't wait for him because he'll swing back in. Welcome to the session, Going Meta, Integrating Metacognitive and Academic Skills with Course Content. My name is Dr. Kim Nelson-Pryor. My full-time job here at the university currently is as Director for Student Affairs Assessment and Analytics within the Division of Student Affairs. And I also serve as an adjunct faculty in the Simmons School, from which I graduated with my PhD in 2021. So glad to be back at SMU, thank you. Before we get to what we're going to do today, I wanted to share a little bit more about me and some of my teaching background, and then ideally to take a little bit of a temperature in the room and figure out who's here and where y'all are coming from. So a little bit about me. As I mentioned, I got my PhD in the Simmons School in Education in 2021, and my dissertation focused on faculty teaching, and in particular, socialization to teach in graduate school, and then in the early career in the context of diverse student bodies. I also have my master's in education from UT Austin in curriculum and instruction. So I was a previously certified public high school English language arts teacher in Central Texas. And overall, I sort of did this. I was like, why should they even listen to me? I'm like, okay. I've got over 10 years of experience teaching in higher education and in other contexts. So I've taught high school English language arts. I've taught GED writing and reading. I've taught humanities, community college classes, test prep, first year seminar at a 4-year institution. And then here at Simmons, I've primarily been involved with teaching graduate level students in higher education and PhD programs. So I would like to learn a little bit more about those of you who are here, both virtually and in the room. You can give as much information as you want, but generally I'd love to hear, what brings you here today? Maybe what level of students are you teaching? Where are you coming from? And what do you hope to get out of this session? I'm going to buck the trend and start with folks who are not in the room to make sure we are getting engaged. So I'm going to go in the order that you appear on my screen. Addie, can we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, so I am a senior instructional designer at the Center for Teaching Excellence. Normally, if I teach people, I do consultations with faculty. So it's one-on-one consultations with faculty, and sometimes adjunct in the Simmons School, and usually, higher ed students. Similar background as you, curriculum instruction, but also focusing on teaching with technology. So very fascinated with metacognition and things like that. So yeah. Excited to be here.
Great.
You're both in the room and not in the room.
Yeah, I'm both in the room virtually and physically, so it's great.
Next on my screen is John Evers. John?
Hi, this is John Evers. I'm in the Lyle School of Engineering, Operations Research and Engineering Management. Specifically, I teach system engineering, and I'm a new full-time faculty to the school, 40 plus years in industry as a system engineer. So I'm interested in this. A lot of what I teach is about system thinking, how to think about how the whole system works in doing system design and developing systems.
Great, welcome, John. Maddie is next. You're muted, Maddie. No worries.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maddie Kulkarni, and I teach in the Cox School of Business. I teach principles of marketing and social impact marketing. And the reason I'm here is because I'm on this learning tour. I'm an adjunct, so I want to learn as much as I can about being a better professor. And you are using terms I had never heard of. So metacognition and all this, I am new to. So I'm here to absorb.
Thanks, Maddie. Kelly.
Hi, so I teach writing and reasoning courses, and I've been at SMU for about a year. And I'm here because metacognition is one of those really hard things to incorporate or teach when we're talking about critical thinking. So I'll take any help you have to offer.
Awesome. And then last but not least in the online crew, Janice.
Hi, I am a music therapist and I teach music therapy in Meadows. And in my practice and what I teach involves a lot of metacognition. And so that was a subject that interested me.
And then in the room,
I'm Mark. I teach in the film department, and I also was intrigued by metacognition. And I'm just generally interested in thinking about pedagogy, and this seemed like a really interesting topic.
great. Last but
And
not least,
I'm Monty McGee from the Statistics and Data Science Department. And I am generally interested in methods that can improve my students' retention of what they're learning, because I find that they typically don't retain from, especially between like from one class to another, because statistics is cumulative. So they're supposed to have seen a bunch of stuff. And when I say, oh, you saw this in your class last semester, they look at me like, I've never seen that in my life. So.
awesome.
I mean, I was supposed to remember things we did last semester.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
this must be fun.
Well, wonderful. Wow, we have great coverage of disciplines and colleges across campus here. I heard of some people talking about sort of different levels of tenure, how long you've been at the university. So welcome to some of the new faculty. Thank you all for joining me today. So here's what I would like to cover today. So the first is sort of metacognition 101. 101, I heard at least one of you mention, this is a word that I haven't thought much about. So what is metacognition? Why is it important? Why should we consider incorporating it into our higher education pedagogy? And then also too, I'm sort of bundling a few other things that aren't metacognition properly, but I think of them as sort of part of the same pie, which is academic skills and then other non-content related course activities that you can incorporate into your pedagogy. So we'll talk about that. And then the most substantive part of the presentation today will be about sort of these three levels of ways in which I've thought that we can infuse metacognition into the classroom. And that is essentially through metacognitive announcements, metacognitive and academic skill and non-course related content activities, and also assignments. And then we'll conclude with just some other resources that you can use to learn more, sort of a teaching toolkit for how to incorporate metacognition. And actually one tool in particular, if we have time, I would love to show you because it is actually a tool to adapt assignments that you already have into work, enhance them with metacognitive components. And like I mentioned to Addie, if any of y'all heard that at the beginning, I'll get your email addresses and then I can share the presentation that will have live hyperlinks after. So you won't have to, jot down URLs and stuff, but we can, you can access resources after we are done. So what is metacognition? So if we think of cognition as thinking, metacognition is thinking about thinking. So stemming from the science of learning, metacognition is a process by which learners think through and beyond course content to explore how they learn. They think about themselves as learners and as critical thinkers. So again, when you're thinking of, wow, that's so meta, right? There's cognition, which is thinking, and then metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. Again, relatedly, but definitely distinct, academic skills reference learning and other academic sort of teaching adjacent skills that students could use in any course, whereas non-course related content I think of as encompassing other details relevant to life on a college campus. So the thing that these three things have in common is that they're sort of separate from the content of the course that you're trying to teach. So whereas metacognition is thinking about thinking and can aid students in becoming better learners, academic skills too, right? So sometimes it's not so much saying, I'm going to lead you on a guided reflection of how we feel about this assignment or what we're still confused about. It's here's a template for taking notes, right? Here is something that you can do after class in order to debrief on what we learned in class. Those type of more tactical, practical academic skills can also be something that you take time in your class via your announcements, via your assignments to incorporate. Non-course related content, which we'll talk about more, is also the type of stuff that can help students better connect with faculty, peers, and their institution. So this is stuff like taking time out to applaud students who had some other event that you went to in the last week, or to talk to students about what they're into on campus or what they're going to be doing this weekend. So again, these are all very different things, but the commonality that they share is that it is taking some time to think about students more broadly than their performance in this class, or more broadly than learners of the subject that I'm teaching. It's thinking about students as learners in general, thinkers in general, and members of our campus community in general. So why is metacognition, why are doing these other things and taking time to help teach students, raise awareness about, and instill in students some of these metacognitive and sort of other more translatable academic skill values? Metacognitive practices, there's a lot of research that shows that metacognitive practices increase students' abilities to transfer or adapt their learning into new contexts and tasks by helping students become aware of their strengths and weaknesses as learners. Hold on, I'm trying to drag this to the top so I can see you all across here. Hold on. By helping students become aware of their strengths and weaknesses as learners, writers, readers, test takers, group members, etc. So again, the takeaway here is that we are zooming a little bit back from how is this student going to fare in my class? How are they going to perform on the assignments I set up for them? How are they going to do on the assessments that I use to assess their progress? And it's thinking through, how can I help this student become a better learner, a better thinker, a better student overall, regardless of the context they go into? So combined with the infusion of more general academic skills and non-course related content into classes, integration of metacognition can help students, again, assess and better understand their strengths and weaknesses. It can help them reflect on their thought processes. It can help them transfer their learning to new contexts. And also it can help them learn about facets of campus life outside the classroom. And again, as well as those effective academic behaviors, which may look like skills of debriefing, attending tutoring sessions, coming to faculty office hours that they can use across all their coursework for the lifetime of their academic life. I wanted also to say, I know Addie is going to monitor the chat and maybe the group online, but if you all have questions, please ask them. I'm trying to figure out where you guys will fit the best. Over here. Okay, so I wanted to do just a tiny example, and that's one of the things that I hope, if nothing else, that you'll take away from today is that metacognition is sort of this intense sciencey word, but there are actually very, very, very incremental, very low lift ways to incorporate it into your classroom. So I wanted to use two examples of metacognitive activities that in terms of asking this question. So one of the first that I like to do sometimes in my classes, it's also useful. Do any of you teach classes with large numbers of students in them? No? Lucky you. If you do, this can be very helpful. So here's it. The question is, how well are we understanding the concept of metacognition? And what I would like you to do, for those of you who are off camera, maybe you could do just one or two, a thumbs up or a thumbs down. But in the room, I want you to use your hand and you can tell me, so 5 fingers is like, I totally understand what metacognition is. I'm ready to go. And a 0 is like, I still don't know what the heck we're doing. And then any of your fingers are one between. So go ahead and think about it. Okay, great. So I know if you're on the Zoom, you can either use the emojis to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
And Maddie mentioned that she has 98 students, so I think it's a pretty large number
Okay.
of students.
Okay, so this is a way, so I just saw some 3s from people in the room, right? So this is definitely a way to, in those larger scale classes, to take the temperature of the room in a little bit more of a formal way than having students just like figuring out if students are staring off into the distance, right? So you're having students reflect on how well am I understanding what's going on right now? That is one example. And I think a 3 is good. I think a 3 is what we're all probably going to be at today. My hope is that what you will also be able to do is to take some of these low lift ways of infusing metacognition into your teaching, take them to your classroom, and then see how it's working for your students and learn more as you do them. Okay, so another metacognitive strategy, which is also a much more general teaching strategy that I'm sure many of you have used before is think, pair, share. Okay, so the question here is, how convinced are we that metacognition can be beneficial? So what I would like you to do is to think. I'll just give you a 1 minute on your own, and then we're going to pair. I'll have those of you in the room pair, and then we'll share out about how convinced are you, or what questions you still have about how and whether metacognition can be beneficial. So
I have something from the chat, which is interesting.
Yep.
John mentioned many of his students are distance asynchronous learners.
Ooh.
So interesting to kind of pose metacognitive activities when your students are not there, because the sessions are recorded.
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
Let me think more on that. Are you doing them in Canvas, John?
Yes, we do
Okay.
the Zoom recording, and then that gets posted into Canvas in the one Panopto folder. But I can have like 3/4 of my students are asynchronous distance learners who are working full time.
Okay, great. I will take pains. I won't lie. A lot of these I've been thinking about the in-class or at least synchronous content, synchronous classroom. But I will take pains when I talk about some of these strategies to think through and to highlight when relevant, how they could be used in your case.
I'll think about it as well, and maybe we can share.
Great. Okay, will you guys pair quick? I know that you maybe you can pick a random person using the private chat function in Zoom and just pick somebody to randomly write a line to about whether you're convinced that metacognition can be beneficial. Take just a minute.
Understanding how you think has got to be beneficial.
Yeah.
Or like, how I learn best. Like I usually like send a survey before the class starts, and like, how do you think that you'll learn best? Like some people's like, oh, I like reading articles, or I like watching videos, I like doing these things. So at least they're thinking about what has worked in the past, and then they can let me know. I'm not going to change the whole course, but at least I have an idea that they're going to be benefiting from different techniques.
When I guess specifically to the question, like I'm with Monty, like I don't know that I understand all the aspects of it, but I'm very convinced just for my own use, like I work better when I understand how I'm trying to think about doing something like, oh, I know I don't learn well from this, so I'm gonna take this approach and it'll be more effective.
Awesome. So I'm hearing some great pairing in the room. And maybe y'all are finding some ways to pair virtually as well. So I'm hearing where the jury's sort of out. We want to understand more. Yeah.
Well, we're convinced that it would be beneficial. We just don't know, I guess, exactly what we're doing, but.
Yeah.
My specific answer to that question would be very convinced, but I'm hoping what I would like to get more of here is like, you don't have to sell me on that. I want to know more about like, how do I use it in my classes?
Yes, great. I'm hopeful that we will do that. So again, think, pair, share is an example of a teaching strategy that you can use for all sorts of purposes, but what can make it metacognitive, and you will see this theme again and again, is this sort of idea of reflection or gauging where we're at or how we feel about how we're engaging with the material, right? So it's not necessarily, although you can totally use and should, and I do, you can use think, pair, share for factual questions, right? How do we understand, trying to think of what the how do we understand, right, how to write a better sentence? How would we revise this sentence or something like that? I'm pulling on like the one content area that I'm familiar with. But if you ask reflection questions and give students some time to think with themselves, pair with a partner and share out, that can be metacognitive as well, because it gets them thinking about, how am I really feeling about what's going on in class right now? What questions do I need answered potentially before we move forward? Or like that information I just got from y'all, you were able to tell me like, there's this thing that I hope that I'm going to get from this session right now. And so I hope we're going to get to that, right? So it can be both a tool for students to be able to reflect, and it can also be a helpful tool for you to gauge sort of the effectiveness and like trajectory of your pedagogy in the moment. So anything else from anybody else want to share out who somehow had an effective pair chat in the online? No worries. Okay. All right. My computer just like turned off and now, okay. So metacognition in the classroom. There are sort of three broad ways in which I want to talk to you, sort of increasing in lift in terms of how you can incorporate metacognition, academic skills, and other non-course related content into your classroom. The easiest lift I think of is announcements. So incorporating metacognition or non-course related information into class announcements. The sort of second, and I would say most common way that people incorporate metacognition into the classroom is via activities. So things that you are doing in class together, or in the case of John, right, things that he is giving students as those activities that are part of the participation grade that they're supposed to go off and do that are sort of during on class time. And then the heaviest lift, which however I've been in classes where it's risen to this level, is that you can actually incorporate metacognition into pre-existing assignments. So you can add it as a metacognitive component on an assignment, or you can actually have full-on assignments that are metacognitive in nature. So let's talk about what those different levels of metacognitive inclusion in the classroom look like. So metacognitive announcements, I've sort of operationalized as where you are using asynchronous, for example, Canvas announcements before students come to class, or brief synchronous, like beginning of class updates, to help students think about their studenthood and their campus life beyond the class. So there are a lot of different formats that this can take, but one of the most basic things you can do to connect students to life beyond your specific course content is by including broader academic announcements or resources. You can even have a class visit. Obviously, that sort of rises to the level of an activity. But for example, the library does a ton of stuff for students, right? They are sending out weekly announcements about everything that's going on at the library. A lot of times they're missing a connection with students because students can have trouble reading all the emails that come across their desk, right? However, if you as a faculty member think, man, I wish my students took more advantage of the library, or there's this cool thing at the Learning Center or the Office of Engaged Learning, an announcement from a teacher, from a faculty member in a Canvas course at the beginning of class, hey, the graduate research symposium is going on this week. If you would like to go take advantage of that, if you're interested in graduate school, here's when it is. That can carry a lot of weight. So this could be just as easy as taking the temperature of what's going on campus academically, or in terms of student life and events, right? For example, and I've never really been involved with undergraduates previous to my current job. I mostly teach graduate students, but now that I'm included into this whole world, there's so much going on campus, right? It was parent and family weekend. It's homecoming coming up. Taking time to have those types of, or just, again, this is literally just in like a Canvas announcement or at the beginning of class, like, hey, did y'all know there's a ton happening on campus this week? Are any of y'all going to homecoming, et cetera, et cetera. There's also student health and well-being resources. So similar to academic resources, there was just a 5K for the Dedman Center. All this is to say we are on a residential college campus for many students who live near campus. And it can be really beneficial and connect students, give students one more touch point to connect to broader campus life in order to for you to just tell them what's going on. You can also, again, sort of the same version of, maybe the more informal version is looking out at your class of, struck fear into my heart, 98 students and seeing that a lot of them look sleepy, right? You could do the finger game or whatever. How ready are we for learning today, right? What's going on? How are we doing? I'm teaching first year PhD students this semester, and I'm trying to earmark some time at the beginning of every class to just take the temperature. How's it going in the program? I went through it. Is there anything else I can help you with? Are there any sort of life issues or life in the program issues that I can help you with? Because all of those things can be barriers to students being able to be present and engage fully in class. Okay, so that's the most basic potential content. You could include that and announce that to students in multiple ways. Possible enhancements, so ways to sort of beef up how you are incorporating this metacognitive or non-course content related information. For example, you could provide extra credit for engagement or event attendance. So this is much more common for students and faculty in some majors, but this is another way of just getting students to go and do things on campus, right? Does anybody here teach first year students?
Sometimes.
Yeah, right. So yeah, potentially similar or first year graduate students, right? Similar principle to my first year PhD students. It's like, okay, just getting to go out and understand on campus and overcoming the barrier of like maybe having to physically attend or access resources. You can do that by providing extra credit. I also know, I will say that I've had students ask for extra credit opportunities before, and I hate coming up with like work to give them extra credit. So I'll either have them like revise an assignment, but this would be a very easy extra credit lift, right? Look at what's going on. There's a research symposium. There's a speaker that's potentially relevant. Go to that and you can get some extra credit points. You can also offer time for students themselves to share announcements about university activities. I don't know if you know this about SMU, we have a very highly involved student body. So by the time these students are upperclassmen, they are leaders of their own activities. They've got things they want to promote. So maybe instead of you, faculty member, running the show and telling them about what's going on around campus, you can open the floor to say, who's got an activity this week? Why do you want to get people involved? Why is it important? Also, too, another possible enhancement here is that there's a lot of research showing that student engagement with different types of things on campus, non-academic things, but also academic support services, so involvement in organizations, use of the gym, use of mental health resources, etc., improve student outcomes. So if students are sort of like, why do I care about this? This is not relevant to the class. You can actually cite show the receipts, right? Cite your sources for why students should engage in this. If their immediate orientation is to just be like, I'm here for my biology degree, right? I don't want to do this other stuff. And then why would we do this? For metacognitive announcements, again, we do this because it raises awareness about and helps students access needed resources, all the resources that we provide for students outside of classroom. In terms of the other sort of components of student life, it can increase student ties to life on campus. It creates opportunities for co-curricular learning, again, when we invite speakers to campus or when we're telling students about other stuff going on. And then also in terms of like the quick check, you can help warm students up for learning, right? Sometimes rooms we know can be cold or you walk in are sort of dead, right? So getting started with some sort of more, let's chat with each other. Does anybody have anything going on that they want to share? Can also help warm up students for learning as well. Yeah.
I don't know if this will be something you get to, but do you have advice or is there research on like, if you're doing these things, is it valuable or neutral or bad to explain why you are doing it? Like say like, okay, I'm going to start every class with an announcement because I am trying to like be more meta about it, I guess.
Yeah.
Probably don't want to phrase it that way.
I do think that one of the sort of principles of metacognition is sort of what's the analogy I'm trying to use? It is sort of inviting students into the secret of learning, right? So I think it's totally fine and probably within the principles of metacognition to say things like, hey, like, I want to do this with you because I think or research shows. I'm not sure that there's research on that specific of a thing about like, if you do these things with students and you tell them why they're doing it or why you're doing it.
With adult learners, there's enough to suggest that if you're explaining why you're doing something, that it's more likely for them to accept it and have benefits from it. So I don't know necessarily research with metacognition, but adult learners, if you have the why you're doing certain things. So even if you're doing a certain activity, you show the, you know, the learning objectives associated. You're doing this because of these learning objectives, or if you're doing this activity because there's research in metacognition that suggests this, like, so.
Well, that's the stuff I was aware of that I was kind of wondering if it applies specifically to the metacognitive aspects of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess just generalizing.
Generalizing, yeah, but with adult learner, well, I mean, think with any learner, if you think about it, I mean, you're only gonna just, if you know that. Yeah, I don't know about like. How much of how much data we have from like explaining. But every time that you justify something, it's better.
And there is, in fact, there's a metacognitive strategy that we'll talk about next, which is closely related to that about assignments.
Right.
But again, in terms of like the empirical research, like I have not yet seen any research that is less than like positive about like, I don't know that you can go overly metacognitive, right? I mean, obviously you can get too confusing for students, or you spend so much time on the metacognitive aspects that then you are running out of time for your content. So I certainly don't think there's any research that it's detrimental. Yeah.
The other thing you could do is like at the start of class, if you create a rhythm of always having activity that is metacognitive for the class, you can say, this is how my classes go. Every day we're gonna start a class with you thinking about your own thinking, or you thinking about your learning. I want you to gauge how you're feeling today before we get started. So, and then just make it part of the class structure. You just tell them about it one time at the beginning of the semester, not every single time.
Yes, and in fact, that's it. So yeah, so again, in announcements, obviously, if you're using class time, it bleeds into activities, right? But in general, I think of these as some of the sort of, again, lowest lift ways that you can start conceptualizing, if you have been so far conceptualizing students as learners and members of the campus community outside of your immediate class context, and spend relatively little time revising your syllabus, etc., revising even how you use class time in order to do it. So the next level up.
And Janice made a comment on Zoom. She said that her experience with neurodiverse learners of all ages support that you have better outcomes if you explain the why. So that can be helpful too.
Yeah. Okay, so metacognitive activities, again, are sort of a step up. You are using in class time, or for John, right, he's actually using the modules or the activities that he's having students do to help students think about their thinking about course content. So this can be much more focused on what is happening in the classroom. There are a ton of these, and I will share a few lists from other institutions' teaching centers with you, and link to them at the end of this presentation, but literally you can search metacognitive teaching strategies and you will find a bunch of excellent examples. So I just pulled out a few that I think are A, things we're already doing pretty commonly in higher education, or B, things that I've personally used or experienced as a learner in the post-secondary context. So metacognitive activities could look like guided reflection prior to and or after content-focused activities. And this can also include assessments, right? So that's thinking through, okay, we're about to take a test today. How are you feeling? Like what grade do you think you're gonna get on the test, right? Or afterwards, let's spend some time. How did that go? What was confusing, right? All the guided reflection means is that you can come up with, if you want students to do a KWL chart, right? What do I know? What do I want to know? What's the L? What did I learn? That's the afterwards. Yes, I was like, what do I know? What do I want to know? What did I learn? Self and peer assessment is also a really common version of metacognitive because it gets students not just thinking about their own work, but also thinking about how they gauge the effectiveness of others' work or their own work as well, right? So this can also come after formal assessments. This can come just after classroom activities or as part of classroom activities. Personal learning checklists is an example of, I've heard these also referenced as like learning manifestos, but like at the beginning of a class, you have a student sit down and draft, maybe they look at the syllabus, they draft their own like list of objectives. What do they want to get out of this class? I actually think that could be really, and actually maybe I'll do it in the future with my graduate students, really effective for graduate students, or really effective if they share them with you for elective classes, where students, you know, it's one thing if students are sort of in a foundational class within that major, they can still use a personal learning checklist, but you're sort of like, okay, here are the 10 things they need to know about biology, versus students coming to an elective class might be coming for lots of different reasons. What do they want to get out of it, right? Or in graduate schools, as students start to specialize, not every student wants the same things out of classrooms. So a personal learning checklist is usually something that occurs toward the beginning of the semester. You could do this as part of an activity when you go over your syllabus toward the beginning of class, and have students sort of gauge like, yeah, these objectives look good to me, this is what I want to get for it, or actually, I want to learn something else. I have a pet interest, I want to use this to follow my my other interests that I have. Think alouds are a great metacognitive activity. So what that looks like, I use those a lot in my secondary teaching, but if you are asking students to solve certain types of complex problems, you as a teacher can engage in a think aloud. You can model it for students where you actually have, like if you had they don't have one in this room, but like, I guess I'm thinking of a problem as like a problem on like a piece of paper, but where you actually talk about how you would solve the problem and you think aloud, literally it is what it says it is, as you solve the problem. You can have students do think alouds as well. There's usually sort of like an I do, we do, you do type of thing. Pre-assessments, I know Addie had already mentioned that, can be a great metacognitive strategy, right? Where are students at? So this can look very small, right? You don't have to give them the whole test at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of the semester, but where are you at on this topic, and understanding where you're at and where your strengths and weaknesses are as a learner on this specific content. Collaborative rubrics are metacognitive and can have the great thing of helping students do your work with you, right? So usually the teacher will already have maybe at least here are the categories of the rubric, right? But a collaborative rubric is where you actually have with students, whether in small groups or whatever, you say, okay, if I want you to have a clear and organized paper, what would a very clear and organized paper look like? What would exemplary look like? What would a bad one look like? What are some examples? And by having students help co-create that rubric, they also are thinking about, what does make something good? What does make a paper clear? And then muddiest point is also one that I know we used in my statistics class when I was in my first year of my PhD program, which was always helpful. And that one is actually super low lift. At the end of class, you give students a piece of paper, or maybe you use like the chat function on Canvas or discussion board, and students just have to say one thing that they are still the most confused about, or that a lingering question, an outstanding question that they have from class. So these are all great metacognitive strategies, and hopefully you're also starting to see that some of these metacognitive things, again, can help you do your work better. Because if you collect all those muddiest points from students, you get a sense of where they're at. What did they actually retain? Do we actually need to spend a little bit more time on that content, etc., before we move on? So potential enhancements, so ways to sort of beef up these activities. So exactly like Addie had said, you can establish a structure or regular cadence for metacognitive reflection in your classroom. For example, and again, this could think, pair, share can be whatever, but if you get students in the habit of doing think, pair, share, right? And then you're always saying, this is when we do think, pair, share, right? Or if you're saying, we will always start class with reviewing what we talked about last time, and then I want you to talk about what you're still concerned about, or what misunderstandings you still have, right? Or if you always have a debrief session, maybe it's optional, but after exams, or after students get their exams back, or after students get their papers back, right? You can actually go ahead and incorporate these into your in-classroom routines, or additional things that you do for students, so that they know to expect it, and they're prompted and they're ready to be metacognitive and to think about themselves as thinkers. You can also tie metacognition into your participation grade. Again, this sort of gets into assignment-y type things, but certainly, like, I know I keep a significant chunk of my grading for participation, and you can definitely put metacognitive stuff in there as well. And then also this idea of gradual release is this, especially this goes closely with established structure or cadence. is if you start leading enough metacognitive activities, students sort of expect it. Eventually, you can have students start leading their own metacognitive activities, which means instead of you having to facilitate reflection or peer assessment or come up with those rubrics, you can sort of gradually release those so that students can manage this process on their own, for their peers, as a group, as individuals, etc. And again, why do we do this? Why would we do metacognitive activities? So we are incorporating metacognition in a monitored, i.e. in-class space, right? So it doesn't necessarily just become more work that students take away and do, and also you can see how it's going for your students, right? It provides an additional check on instructional effectiveness, right? So if you are sort of constantly polling students about the muddiest point and you're getting every single topic that you covered, or you're consistently getting one topic that students are like, I just don't know what's going on with this, that can help you improve your effectiveness by covering that topic potentially in a different way. And it provides additional opportunities for formative assessment. So as students are going through class, right, especially some courses where the focus is on really big assignments, you can have sort of shorter form formative assessment as you go by incorporating metacognitive activities. And then last but not least, the biggest lift, and again, I think most of you will find your sweet spot in metacognitive activities, especially with students who don't necessarily do it commonly. This is probably the most common way that these things play out. But you can also take metacognition to the next level by having components of or full-blown metacognitive assignments. So I'm thinking about assignments as distinct from activities as they are some portion of the course grade that's not participation. So you are using those course assignments that students usually spend time working on outside of class to formalize students' thinking about course content. So what could these look like? Obviously, you can have a straight up reflection assignment, right? You can have it at the beginning of the semester to have students personally connect to course content. I teach in sort of the human sciences, right? So this has been easier for me, but I've used this with students in a history of higher education class. You can have this reflection for students who are starting off, for example, in a major, right? What are their goals? What are their personal connections to this academic area? So that can be its full own standalone assignment, a reflection on, tell me about this course, what does it mean to you, what are your goals, why are you here, etc. Another one that's more retroactive and that I've used in a number of classes across different types of content is a portfolio. So usually with metacognition, there's an inclusion of a narrative as well, but it's sort of like at the end of the semester, this depends on how many like assignments you have in a class, right? But at the end of the semester, the student collects their own exemplary work and writes some reflection and packages them into a portfolio to say, here was the work that I did in class, here are the 3 pieces that I'm most proud of, and here's a little bit about what they show about me as a learner or writer or thinker on this topic. Learning logs can also be incorporated as part of a participation grade or as their standalone thing. So this is more like we were talking about those personal learning checklists, right? This could be almost like a journal that you're asking students to keep throughout the life cycle of a course, where students are ruminating on how it's going, right? I mean, truly think of it as like a diary of how you're doing in the class. And maybe they can, maybe you don't even read it necessarily, right? Maybe it's a completion grade, but they fill it out throughout the life of class and turn it in at the end. You can have students create exam questions. So think about how this is metacognitive as opposed to just having students be sort of the passive recipients of an exam that you give them that has predetermined questions. You can turn around and ask students to then create exam questions, which has them think about what is the knowledge that I need in this class? How are questions put together? Is this question hard? What makes it hard? What would make it harder? A post-exam autopsy, we already talked about having debriefs, but you could have students do a written component or assignment after an exam to talk about how it went or why they think, for example, what went wrong, or why they think what went well. And then this one actually was making me think of when you were asking, like, is there research that shows that students care about the why you're doing it? This is a standalone piece of writing, the statement of interest, important, and audience, and certainly you could do this as an in-class activity, but it could rise to the level of an assignment as well, where when you're giving students an assignment that you had already created, you ask them to devise why do they think you, the teacher, decided to give them this assignment, right? How is it of interest? Why is it important? Who is it for? Is it only for this class? Is this a piece of writing that I could potentially bring and use in a different venue? Or like, I don't know that we have a film, you're in film, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, right, like, is this just for this class? Is there a application of this beyond the class, etc.? So again, a lot of these can have multiple formats that they're in, but all of these can sort of be standalone pieces of writing or output, like the creation of exam questions that you can actually assign and then assign a grade to.
I love the idea of the learning logs, you know, especially it could be applicable to all the subject matters that everybody's here. And even like if you are compiling that data and maybe you're just like rating your knowledge throughout like every week where you are and understanding, and you can put it, you can graph it out, how your students are doing, how well they're understanding the concepts weekly, or, you know, if you see 1 week everybody's struggling, you can always kind of beef up resources for that particular topic later on for future semesters. So
yeah, and I'll tell you, I had as part of at my college that I went to, we had sort of a first year seminar program, but they were all topical, right? As opposed to like I've taught a first year seminar where it's like sort of basic study skills, campus resources. I'm not sure, do we have anything like that on SMU campus? Like that all first year students take a
no, not at SMU.
Yes, okay.
Other universities do.
Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've taught a class like that, but they don't have it at SMU.
Yeah, okay, so in my undergraduate institution, there was a version of that, but it was all super topical. But I remember, I don't know that she would have called it a learning log, but my teacher had us do, it was basically like it was a journal, and it really towed the line, especially, I was 18 at the time, between academic and personal. And yet it was me coming into college, grappling with these ideas that I was learning in this class that were totally new to me, grappling with not only what things mean, but also what they mean to me, whether I'm interested in them. It was not in a field that I went on to like continue to study, but just that process of doing that, and then it was for a major grade, right? And she would actually read them. I mean, this is a big lift on her. This is why we get into the heavy lift here. She read them on a weekly basis and would respond.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to do that. And you also don't have to, you can close the door to more personal types of reflections or whatever, but exactly like what you're saying, similar to the muddiest point, but on steroids, right, is if you're having sort of students on whatever semi-regularly basis reflect in written form about how they're doing in class, it can give you a ton of great data about what's going well, what else is going on in these students' lives, etc.
And John also mentioned that he has students submit golden nuggets in a campus discussion. And what is a bit of knowledge that really stood out for them or key point that they want to remember. And then he compiles and shares those among the students.
Oh, I love that.
That's the opposite of the muddiest point.
Yes, a golden nugget. That's beautiful. I love that. Okay.
This also reminds me of something called a race report. I mean, that literally after a race, I mean, I've used it in vets and in like after a physical activity, but it's the same idea as I think maybe a post-exam autopsy. There's 4 questions. What went well? What didn't go well? What would you not change? What would you change?
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
Think about this like midterm semester feedback too, and like, okay, we're halfway through the semester. Here's what our objectives were. How are you doing on each of these? What would help you move up on these?
Mm-hmm.
what do you need more time on and stuff like that. Which I've always thought it was like useful for me, like to know how the course is going, but I'm curious, I never really thought about like what's the use for them if they're like, oh, I didn't realize I was supposed to be learning this, I should be thinking about that more.
No, 100%, and that's I think one of the great things about metacognition, and I think one of the things that can help you overcome the barriers to including it, because it is this like science of learning term, is that a lot of it's really helpful to you as a faculty member too, and as a professor. But yes, bringing students also into the idea of not only, okay, what can I, the teacher, do better, but also what can you as a student, what do you need to focus on more, right? So possible enhancements for metacognitive assignments, and I'll show you this worksheet. I will, spoiler alert, it's at the secondary level, but I think it's useful. So one of the things you can do too, instead of creating full-blown other assignments, right? If you're just like, honestly, I've taught this course for 5 years, I've got it down to a T, I just don't have room. Maybe learning logs could be an additional thing, but I don't have room to grade it. You can add metacognitive components to traditional assignments. And then maybe it becomes a separate sort of piece on your rubric where after students turn it in, they also do some sort of reflection. But it doesn't require a terrible amount of addition or adaptation to make a lot of more traditional assignments that at least have some metacognitive components. You can provide metacognitive assignments for extra credit, right? So especially among students, I mean, think about this. So students who are potentially struggling in your class, who are already going to be the ones knocking down your door asking for extra credit activities, right? So if you say, okay, well, I want you to really, you failed this exam, right? We need to do a deep dive. We need to do an autopsy on what happened here. You can provide that extra credit for that. You can allocate portions of your participation grade in metacognitive activities. It's usually sort of a low lift. And then you can also, this is related to that gradual release, have students themselves or former students lead others in metacognitive activities. And by former students, I'm particularly thinking about, I mean, I think we do this more at the graduate level, right? You have alumni from the program who have graduated and are working in the field, come back, to just talk about what they've done, but you could have them talk about, here's how I felt when I was a first year PhD student, right? Here were the confusions that I have. Here were the things that I learned during my second year. You could even do this too at the level of, again, we have a lot of really, really involved upperclassmen here at SMU. So if you have a student who is an awesome example of a senior chemistry major who's crushing it and who had an upward trajectory, right? You can bring that student in to your first semester chemistry class to talk to students about their experience or to lead them in metacognitive activities. So actually having students lead can be a really powerful way too of sort of fully achieving the dream of metacognition, where it's truly students leading themselves in thinking about thinking. And again, the reason why we would do metacognitive assignments, it helps telegraph, like, if I want to know your values, show me a grade book, right? So actually grading metacognitive activities can telegraph that metacognitive skills are valued. And also, just like anything else, that they're not necessarily innate, right? I think about this a lot related to academic skills as well. We all know that students come to college from different backgrounds, and some students know how to take effective notes. They've had practice doing it before, and other students haven't ever done it before, right? So this idea that there are academic skills, but sort of this hidden curriculum, right, of these are the ways to be an effective student. If we actually hold these things up, help students do them, and then value them by grading them and including them in their grades, that helps telegraph, like, hey, we're not all just as good as we are at learning, and that's what it is, right? This is a skill that can be taught, and it's something that we value in my class. Doing assignments provides space for extended and in-depth metacognitive practice, right? So unlike sort of one-off activities or announcements, obviously this would be more like, if you were going to have students do a learning log, you might have to think sort of hard, right? How much of my grade bandwidth is that going to take up? What's this going to look like? What format? How am I going to have enforcement, right? If students aren't turning in my learning logs, etc. And then also, as we were just talking about, this can help improve your teaching effectiveness too. So, particularly with assignments, right? Depending on how often you were looking at a learning log or post-exam autopsies, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have actionable data and takeaways to then go the very next day and change how you teach, but maybe the next semester when you teach it, you'll say, geez, like a lot of students really, I just lost a lot of students in the middle of the semester vis-a-vis these learning logs, right? Students just didn't seem to be getting very much out of it during that really busy time in the semester. How can I overcome that? Okay, so I'm trying to think if I have another pseudo metacognitive strategy to get you to answer this reflection question. I don't really, besides just thinking about it, but we've talked about announcements. It's probably a little too late for assignments, right, in the semester because the syllabus and the grading is probably set. But maybe there's an activity. Which of the metacognitive strategies that we talked about today seem like something you could implement this semester?
I like the idea of going through the learning objectives from the beginning of the course and maybe having this do like my next assignment doesn't have to be an assignment about course content. It could be, okay, here I want you to, here's our learning objectives, rate each one on 1 to 5 on how you think you understand it. Yep. And
I love that.
And make it either a class assignment. I do in-class assignments, activities every day that I grade, just complete or non-complete, and do it like that. Or maybe even make it an anonymous survey so that way they don't feel like they're being judged. Yeah. So
I think that's really powerful, especially because a lot of times too, we're also constantly trying to get other ways for students to like refer back to the syllabus, right? You're like, it's in the syllabus, right? You're like, these objectives, they weren't just here on week 1 and then they went away. That's a great example. Like a sort of a mid-semester objective check-in.
mm-hmm.
What else?
I like the idea of the muddiest point and golden nugget, kind of connecting those at the end of each day. And you mentioned kind of like writing them down. I was actually thinking, I teach very small classes, so this would be easier. But like set aside 2 minutes at the end and kind of go around, because that way I think it's useful if everyone else also hears like, oh, this person, whatever their thing was that was useful, they learned like, oh yeah, let me file that. It's like reiterating that. And then also several people are like, yeah, we were all struggling with the same thing. I think that could be not just useful for me, but useful for them kind of understanding where the rest of the class is. I
also really like that because it normalizes the idea that, again, that like hidden, it's not like at the end of class, everybody else is like, oh yeah, I got 100% of that, right? Like it normalizes this idea that like, actually I'm still confused about something, or I'm hoping that we learn more about this later, or I didn't get that at all. So I like especially in a small class, I think that's really powerful.
And I was thinking that could be a nice thing then to tell me like, okay, whatever the common muddiest point was, that's what we're starting next week with, is kind of hit that again for next class.
I like that. I also really do like the golden nugget too. Because sometimes, right, we have all had those moments as learners where you have something that like, then you're like, oh, that's the way I'm gonna write those types of sentences. And right, there's just something that is gonna stick with you. Oh, I'm over time, sorry. Okay, I didn't even realize that, okay. This is mostly, I will share this with you after all, but so in terms of metacognitive announcements, if your heartstrings aren't fully into the metacognitive space, but you're like, I could start doing, you know, a little bit more to tell my students what's going around on campus, places and resources that you can look at. There are weekly email announcements that we all receive. There are lots on Fridays. There's a Friday update about student life. The Provost sends out weekly updates. SMU 360 is our platform for campus organizations and events. And then there's also static resources and Mustang Startup, which is our virtual orientation. There's a static list online that like, those are the things that we are asking first years to be aware of, right? Things like tutoring, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a great list of sort of like, these are the resources that we've determined as a university are like helpful for students, not just new students, because a lot of students don't use them, but for students to know. For activities, like I mentioned, if you are interested in metacognitive activities, the web is replete. So a few good examples were the University of Oregon Teacher Effectiveness has a great list. DePaul has a great list. this one is life sciences specific. This is actually an empirical article, but I really liked that she did a really good job with some checklists of, here, let me show you. Nope, sorry, not Edge. Who's using Edge? Anyway, you can click on it. There's really nice checklists of different assignments. And then for assignments, which we won't have time, the APA puts out a metacognitive assignment revision tool, which I think is actually very approachable. It's for high school psychology is the specific content area that it's talking about, but what it does is it walks you through just a very easy task to revise existing lessons to promote metacognition. And it just has some things that teachers can go through and questions that they can ask, and then a sort of checklist that they can fill out to create examples of assignments that weren't metacognitive before and now are metacognitive after this revision. So I'm happy to email that to everybody who is here, and that is it. Okay, thank you all so much for coming, especially those of you online. Not especially, I mean, I don't need to.
Whatever.
I very much appreciate it. Okay. You gonna stop recording?
Something.
Yes.
Okay. This is like the format. He's in the middle of it. Get really